presenters. First presenting is Dr. Russell Mittermeier. He will be talking on the importance of HFLD countries in the global climate picture. Russ Mittermeier, as we know him, has been working in Suriname for almost 45 years now and has done his PhD actually in Suriname. Russ, welcome. After Russ, the next panel member that will present is Mr. Dr. Rudy van Kante, and he will be presenting on science and sustainable development in perspective to what we have in Suriname. Dr. Rudy van Kante has a PhD in agroforestry and worked in agroforestry and biodiversity conservation research, at the agroforestry and biodiversity conservation research at the Center of Agricultural Research in Suriname, CELOS, from 2003 till 2005. From 2005 to 2008, as the director of CELOS, and since 2008, he works as the director of Tropobos Suriname. From 2004 onwards, he is a part-time lecturer at the Anton de Kom University. His current fields where he works in is forest management, forest policy, landscape governance, RED+, participatory research, and agroforestry. Next speaker will be Dr. Tom Evans from Wildlife Conservation. Dr. Tom Evans works at Wildlife Conservation Society, where he leads the cross-cutting program on forest conservation and climate change. He supports efforts by Wildlife Conservation Society field programs to link climate finance and better forest protection, and coordinates WCS work on Intact Forest Initiative. He worked extensively on the ground in conservation programs and field research in Southeast Asia and Africa. Welcome, Tom. Next, we have then the two ladies, Dr. Danye Maniatis and Kimberly Todd from UNDP. They will be presenting on lessons learned from efforts to finance protection of HFLD areas using existing mechanisms and options for enhancing support. Dr. Danye is Senior Policy and Technical Advisor for the Climate and Forest team in Asia Pacific, overseeing the portfolio and leading the regional team. She supports government to develop and implement national RED+ strategy, investment frameworks, and leverage innovative climate finance. Currently, her focal countries include Indonesia, Myanmar, Cambodia, Mongolia, and Bangladesh. Within the climate and forest team, she also has a global function on technical RED+ aspects related to nationally determined contributions, policy, and partnership advice. She manages the partnership. She manages together with her team a partnership that the Italian Ministry of Environment, Land and Sea, as well as the partnership with the European Forest Institute for RED+ and FLAG facilities. Daniel has previously worked in and/or provided support to several HFLD countries in their work on sustainable management for forest and REDD+, including Gabon, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Suriname. Daniel holds a doctoral degree in geography from the University of Oxford, as well as a master's degree in oceanography and marine biology from the University of Marseille in France. Environmental science and technology from the Free University of Brussels, and climate change and management from the University of Oxford. She holds a bachelor degree in environmental science from the University of East Anglia. That's a lot. You've done a lot, Daniel. Kimberly Todd is a global advisor with the United Nations Development Program, Climate and Forest Team, based in New York. In that role, she provides technical support on forest and land use change in the context of climate change. Before joining UNDP, she was a policy analyst with the United States Environmental Protection Agency. In that position, she was a member of the US delegation to the UNFCCC negotiations with a focus on REDD+, and was one of the coordinators of the US greenhouse gas inventory reporting. She holds a Bachelor of Science degree in biology from Boston College, as well as a Master of Science degree in biology from Fordham University. She also has a Master of Public Administration in Environmental Science and Policy from Columbia University. And as a discussant, we have our colleague James Funk. James is the principal and founder at the Land Use and Climate Change Knowledge Initiative. Welcome, James. If we may start with the first presenter, Russ, can I invite you to the stage and give your presentation? Thank you. Oh, you got it. No, that's, so it's this one here, right? Right. Okay.
Good morning, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers, UNDP, UNDESA, and the cabinet of the president in the person of Ambassador Larkin. Thank you very much for this invitation. For alla mi sranang mati, mi wanitaki fosi dati mi brete fo kombaka na yung moi kondri dat mi lobby so furu. This jari go meki 44 jari dati mi konjaso. So this is the title of my presentation. I'll just let you read it. What I'm basically going to do in this presentation is give you a little bit of the history of HFLD very briefly, because I know there's a white paper on it that's been circulated. How do we define HFLD? What are the HFLD countries and regions? What do we count as HFLD? I'm going to focus in on the Guiana Shield region where we located, and especially the importance of Suriname. I'll talk a bit about tropical forests and climate change, particularly the great significance of primary forests, how everything is interconnected, a little bit on the great importance of indigenous people and local communities, and then a few words about the future. Now, the concept of HFLD originated about in the middle of the last decade, and in 2007, several of us, myself included, also Minister Carlos Manuel Rodriguez from Costa Rica, published a paper called No Forest Left Behind, which highlighted the importance of the HFLD countries, and we identified them using this, this matrix where you have on top low forest cover, high deforestation rate, low deforestation rate, and in the lower right-hand corner, you have the countries that came out as HFLD at the time, more than 50% forest cover, and less than 0.22 annual deforestation rate. You see them listed here. Suriname at the top, and French Guiana, Gabon, Belize, et cetera. Most of these countries are represented in this meeting today, if not all. I think all may be here. Those countries at the time came up with 18% of total forest carbon. But what we need to do now really is, is look at what we're really talking about in terms of HFLD. What do you want to include in HFLD, and how do you want to define it? I think if we look at those regions that have portions of the country in HFLD, Brazil, the northern and western Amazon, Venezuela, south of the Orinoco, Indonesia, the provinces of Papua, the two provinces in Papua, and Papua New Guinea, we're going to come up with more than 50% of forest carbon in these HFLD regions and countries. Now, what you don't want to be is a biodiversity hotspot. This is another category of very high priority areas, 36 areas around the world that have the majority of terrestrial biodiversity in them. The best symbol for this is the island of Madagascar, where I also spent a lot of time. I was just there 2 weeks ago. It's a wonderful place, very high levels of diversity and endemism. It's the highest priority biodiversity hotspot, wonderful ecosystems, but 90% lost. This is what much of Madagascar looks like. Much of it is an ecological disaster. And every year, the rivers run red with eroded soil. This is not what you want to wind up looking like. Now, in terms of the region that we're in, I want to highlight the very great importance of the Guiana Shield region. This is the world's most intact rainforest region. This is a little more detail on it. It's part of the Amazonian forest, but not all of it is part of the Amazon River drainage. You have the rivers of the Guianas flow north into the Atlantic, whereas the southern part of the Guiana Shield flows into the Amazon and is part of the Amazon drainage. There's a lot of scientific information available on this region, going back to the workshop that we did in 2002 in this hotel, looking at the priority areas within the Guiana Shield. And some of the recent publications that have come out have shown how tremendously important this region actually is. The title of this article, the Guiana Shield Rainforest, Overlooked Guardians of South American Climate. The region is largely overlooked. It has enormous importance in continental and global climate regimes. And the impact of deforestation here, even a relatively small amount of deforestation, could have devastating effects as far away as the La Plata Basin in Argentina, 4,000 kilometers away, which is one of the major agricultural regions in the world. Within the Guiana Shield region, really the centerpiece is Suriname, the greenest country on earth. If you don't believe it's the greenest country on earth, just look at this map. And I came here originally in 1975 to work on the monkeys, which is why I started my presentation with the picture of a white-faced saki. There are 8 species of monkeys here. I worked on them for several years in the late 1970s to do my PhD. And especially in this region, the Voltsberg, which is in the Central Suriname Nature Reserve. If you have an opportunity to go there, it's an absolutely fabulous place. You stand on top of this mountain, you look 360 degrees, every direction, unbroken, intact, pristine tropical forest. Suriname's a very unique and very special country. As has already been said, it has 93% forest cover. The government has committed to keeping 93% forest cover. This is the highest percent rainforest cover on Earth. Every analysis of forest cover that has ever been done has Suriname at the top of the list. Most of this is primary forest. Here you see some scenes of what it looks like. Absolutely fantastic. Highest per capita forest resources of any country. Highest per capita water availability of any country, along with Iceland, which is not known for its tropical forest. It has low human population density, only about 550,000 people. Most of them live along the coast, and especially in the capital city of Paramaribo. And as the Vice President already said, Paramaribo is a World Heritage Site. You walk a few hundred meters from the hotel here, and you'll see wonderful old colonial buildings. You can visit this historic fort, which has an enormous history, not just for Suriname, but for the entire Americas. And in the interior, most of the people, a small population, live in villages like this. This is the village of Kwamalasamutu in the far south of Suriname. It's a trio Indians and a number of other people. Unique cultural diversity, the Vice President already referred to this. You have Hindu temples next to mosques, next to synagogues, next to Christian churches, all within a few blocks of one another. And in the interior, you have the original inhabitants, the Amerindians, and you have the Maroons, the African communities that are truly unique, and my favorite group of people really in the world. You also have a rich biodiversity, the monkeys again, cock of the rock, fantastic bird that you can see here easier than anywhere else in the world. Globally important nesting sea turtle beaches and overwintering sites for North American migrant birds. This is the Okopipi. This is a blue poison dart frog, which is endemic to Suriname. And you have a long history of conservation in this country, going back to the 1950s, and the most recent creation is that big area in the central part of the country, the 1.6 million hectare Central Suriname Nature Reserve, created in 1998, and it became a World Heritage Site almost immediately thereafter in 2000. The person doing the analysis said it was the most pristine site he had ever analyzed in 600 visits to different parts of the world. So Suriname is a truly unique global brand, and I really hope that you will have the time to appreciate it and go out and see some of the wonders, both in the city and in the rest of the country. But my main purpose here is not to sell you on Suriname, even though I've been doing that for more than 40 years. It's to talk a little bit about forests and climate change. We have the Paris Agreement, which after many conferences on climate, and I went to a lot of them, finally came up with a global agreement. Now, one particular large developed country for the moment has pulled out of it, but we'll just forget about that for the moment because I think he won't be there for too much longer, we hope. So forest carbon, REDD plus, reduction in deforestation and degradation. We know this is a priority. What's really interesting is the fact that all evidence points to the fact that at least 30% of the solution to climate change, short and medium term, could be through tropical forest conservation and restoration. It's an immediate low-cost solution. It's the most low-cost solution we have out there. But nonetheless, it's still gotten less than 2% of the global investment. Now, I want to highlight in particular the importance of primary forests. They have a critical role, these old-growth primary forests. They serve as a global carbon sink. They continue to accumulate carbon over the centuries and contain vast quantities of it. There's a misconception that old trees no longer absorb carbon, but large old trees are not just senescent carbon reserves. They actively fix large amounts of carbon compared to smaller trees, often much larger amounts. Tree carbon accumulation increases continuously with tree size, and a relatively small number of very large, slow-growing trees are responsible for a huge portion of the carbon capture. And this was highlighted in an article that came out a few years ago called Hyperdominance in Amazonian Forest Carbon Cycling. And when I saw this article, I said, oh my God, why didn't I write this? It's an absolutely brilliant piece that shows that 1% of rainforest trees in Amazonia sequester 50% of the carbon. Think about that. 1% of the trees are responsible for 50% of the carbon capture, which is really staggering. And I looked at the list. It's about 20 species, and I recognized a lot of them. And why did I recognize a lot of them? Because they are dispersed by some of my friends, the monkeys, especially the black spider monkey, the quata, which is the best indicator for a healthy forest in the Guiana Shield region. If you have black spider monkeys in the forest, it's a healthy forest. If you don't, something is probably wrong. These animals disperse large amounts of seeds of some of these hyperdominant species. You also have dispersion taking place with some of the large frugivorous birds like the black curassow, the poisi here in Suriname. Tapirs are also big dispersers, and even forest floor tortoises, which walk around on the forest floor, eat these large seeds, and then drop them out wherever they go. Unfortunately, these are the first species to get wiped out by hunters. If hunters go into a particular area, these are the target species that hunters prefer to go after. Also, the big trees, the slow-growing, hardwood, emergent trees, are also the ones that are sought after by the loggers. So you get a double whammy. You get these trees being taken out, and you get your dispersers hunted out very quickly whenever there's some sort of movement into these forests, usually facilitated by logging roads. which make a general mess of things. Now, it's often said that, well, logging is good for local communities. I'd really like to see some concrete examples of that. Here's an example, again, from Madagascar, the northeastern part of the country. In 2009, there was a coup in Madagascar. There was an immediate invasion of certain protected areas there. Local people were enlisted to illegally cut down rosewood, which is a very, very valuable species. If they made $1 a day, if they actually got paid, they were lucky. These timbers were sent to China illegally, and there they were turned into $1 million rosewood bed frames. So I don't think too much of that $1 million came back to the local people. In general, logging of tropical forests, for a variety of reasons, is not a great idea. Now, if you want to continue logging, it's your right to do it as a sovereign nation, and I'm talking about commercial logging here, not local use, but please don't call it sustainable, because it's not. Last but not least, I want to talk about the great importance of indigenous people. They are responsible for about 20% of the land area of the planet. They are major stakeholders, and they should be very significant beneficiaries of anything that we do in terms of HFLD, in terms of forest carbon. One very good example is that of the Kayapo people in the southern Brazilian Amazon. It's an area that's heavily impacted by soy and cattle ranching. You see where these people are located in the southern Amazon. Their area is basically the last significant remnant of forest in that part of southern Brazil. And there's about 8,000 of them. They are in an area of 11.5 million hectares. It's about 2/3 the size of Suriname. Working with them through our organization, Conservation International, we created an $8 million trust fund to help them, and they continue to protect this land very significantly. But they also need to benefit from any kind of carbon deals that can be put together. The bottom line, everything is interconnected. Biodiversity, tropical forests, indigenous people, local communities, climate change, and we need a holistic approach to be truly successful. We still have a long way to go. We have to convince the world to change some of the old entrenched behaviors that date back to the 19th century and continue to dominate some of the thinking. But there is increasing interest in supporting green growth initiatives at scale. I particularly want to highlight the wonderful commitment of the government of Norway, which has really been enormously supportive of all of these things. I wish we could get 5 or 6 other countries to do what Norway has done. They really have done a stellar job. I think there is a representative of Norway here, and I hope he'll talk to us about why and how they have made this great commitment. And of course, we now have the Green Climate Fund as well, which could really change the scale of everything that we're doing. And one of the suggestions I would like to make is, what about a special window for HFLD countries in the Green Climate Fund? That would be a major advance, a major step forward. With that, I'll finish by saying that forests are worth much more standing than cut down for other land uses. Hopefully, the world is now ready to recognize and act on this. And I really think that this conference could take us a long way to help making all of this a reality. And I want to point out that I have here for the delegates, I have about 50 copies of a book that we did. Yeah, there it is. It's heavy. Cyril Kormos, who is in the audience as well, he's the senior author on it. I'm one of the authors. And in the closed session, we're going to hand these out to the delegates. So thank you very much for your time, Tangi, and I look forward to the rest of the conference.
Thank you, Russ, for indeed highlighting the importance of especially the rainforest for fighting climate change. We'll move to the next presenter. I invite Dr. Rudy van Kanten to give his presentation. Rudy will talk about science and sustainable development.
Good morning, a special welcome to all the visitors from abroad. I hope you enjoy both the conference as well as your stay in Suriname. The presentation today is on science and sustainable development from the perspective of Suriname. As a country rich in natural resources, we face the challenge also to achieve economic growth and development and preserve nature at the same time. Our economy is heavily leaning on mining. The forestry sector offers less than 6,000 jobs. And within the National RED Plus strategy, gold mining has been identified as the largest driver of deforestation, and what we call conventional logging as the largest driver of forest degradation. In the last 10 years, timber production has increased threefold to almost 1 million cubic meters a year. And the majority of these logs are exported as roundwood. An unidentified part of what we call conventional logging does not comply with the code of conduct of the Forest Service. And obviously, this leads to forest degradation. Here we can see the fellows from the Forest Service doing research on forest degradation. The Amerindians and the Maroon people can be seen as guardians of the forest. And the Suriname, in fact, that is the only university in our country. There are 5 faculties and a number of affiliated institutes. Within others, silos, which host a special forest with the oldest tropical forest experiment in the world. It was established in the 60s and is known by every forester as the Suriname system. The university has 3 strategic pillars. One is, as the Vice President mentioned, we have a unique composition of our population, and that is the diversity of society, which agglomeration of large world ethnicities and religions where no one is dominant. The second pillar is biodiversity and ecosystems, geological and geological diversity. As Russ mentioned, we are part of the Guyana Shield, which also has great similarities with the Amazon. And the third pillar is sustainable local development with emphasis on local production, added value, and sustainable management. As a developing country, there is a need to collect more and analyze reliable and accurate data, and also for multidisciplinary participatory research within and beyond the university, involving national and international partners such as universities and non-governmental organizations. This surely will contribute to evidence-based policy advice and better management practices. There is ongoing research in biodiversity, climate vulnerability and adaptation to climate change, sustainable forest management, lesser known timber species, land use planning, mangrove rehabilitation, also the multiple use management of mangrove forest. The mangroves are an important part of our forest. The use of non-timber forest products including medicinal plant and oils, and also agroforestry. Here you can appreciate multiple use management area in our coastal part of the country. As I said, the mangroves are very important, and this is a research going on to involving multiple stakeholders to manage the area. Recently, the Forest Service has made good progress in forest monitoring and a national forest inventory. And they also have an interactive website which makes the information available and also offers the opportunity to organizations to upload information after consulting the Forest Service. The cross-cutting development capacity project coordinated by the National Institute for Environmental Research, NIMOS, has also made data sets available, visible for users. And we also have, with support of the UNDP, environmental statistics produced by the General Bureau of Statistics. Lastly, the National RED Plus strategy, which is in the process of validation, offers opportunities for green development. And also within the topic of ecosystem-based research and climate-smart landscape governance, there is a use role for science to achieve sustainable development. In this process, leaving no group behind. This is the same river. In fact, if you walk out the hotel, you will meet the Suriname River. This is a much more pristine part. And I will leave you at least with two words in Surinamese. Grand Tanyi means thank you. Muchas gracias. Muito obrigado. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Rudy, for giving the Surinamese perspective with respect to science and sustainable development. The next speaker is Dr. Tom Evans from Wildlife Conservation Society, which will talk about the importance of HFLD countries and the regions. Dr. Tom Evans, you have the floor.
Thank you, Cedric. And thank you also to Ambassador Lakin and the other organizers for the opportunity to address this very distinguished audience. I'm going to zoom back out to a global level now and talk about some of the scientific aspects of the HFLD concept and some of the challenges that it has faced in acceptance and some of the new and emerging science which may help to breathe a bit of new life into it and help with this effort to revive the concept. So I guess, which direction should I point this to get? Okay. You've worn it out, Russ. Up and right. Okay, thank you very much. So it's widely recognized that we have to address emissions from forests if we're going to get on top of the global climate challenge. Those emissions are coming primarily from deforestation and degradation, particularly tropical countries, and they represent more than 10% of the global flow of human emissions into the atmosphere. In recognition of this, a part of the Paris Agreement has been created to how's the REDD+ approach, which is a mechanism which should enable, provides positive incentives for developing countries to assist them to reduce their emissions from deforestation and degradation. And this has been a huge step forward in efforts to address climate change. It's come to be primarily focused on areas which are hotspots of deforestation, frontiers of rapid deforestation. Those are important, but they are not the whole story of emissions from the global forest estate. REDD+ works in this way because of the way that the incentives are structured. For a country to receive incentives, its performance is measured by comparing its expected rates of forest emissions from the rates of forest emissions that take place. And those expected rates are dependent on the historical rates of loss in that country. And so in a country which has high rates of past loss, there's great scope to reduce in the future, and so to receive incentives. But in countries such as the HFLD countries, there's a much lower scope for doing that because the past rates of loss are very low, so there's not much space to reduce any further. And so that makes it difficult for those countries to participate in the process. And that was recognized as a structural problem right from the beginning of the process. Let's try. I have a magic touch. This is the same diagram that Russ showed earlier. That was a path-breaking paper that he was involved in 2000. Oh, this is not. In 2007, which identified a set of countries that were particularly affected by this issue. And it was recognized at the time that it was important to develop alternative incentives to enable those countries to continue to have low rates of deforestation and degradation. And there was a relatively short list of countries that were recognized in that list. And the broad concept was recognized in the final framework for REDD+ under the Paris Agreement, the Warsaw Framework. But the HFLD approach has not been very widely operationalized since then. It exists as a principle, but it's not been operationalized. And really the aim of this conference is to revisit this idea and try to identify ways in which it can be operationalized in practical ways. If we're to do so, it's important that the framing is uses the best current science. And in that context, one thing to bear in mind is that when the HFLD idea was first presented in 2007, low deforestation was defined as being below global average deforestation rates at that time. If we update the list of countries to the current day, if we choose to take that approach, global deforestation rates are somewhat lower now, according to the FAO. So I think it would be wise to review countries that were in that list to make sure the data is still consistent with the current situation. But my feeling, as Russ has already outlined, is that it might be more constructive, rather than focusing on a narrow and exclusive list of countries who can participate, is to think a bit more broadly about the HFLD challenge, because it applies to forests in many countries around the world, including large regions of countries such as Indonesia and Brazil and many other places. And so it may be smart to bring in a broader group of countries who all face this issue and think of this more as a challenge with the financial approach of REDD+, rather than a challenge for a particularly narrow set of countries. One way of thinking about this in a slightly different way might be to look at those areas of the world's forests which are most ecologically intact, have the highest ecological integrity. This is a draft map, a work in progress, attempting to identify such areas. The blue The blue ones are the most intact. You can see they occur across many parts of the tropical zone and also in the boreal zone. These are areas which have the lowest levels of industrial human use. And so you can think of them, I guess, in a sense as HFLD areas. Some of them are whole HFLD countries like Guyana and Suriname. Others are HFLD regions or landscapes in a sense. And all of them share the characteristics that they have exceptionally high climate importance, but find it very difficult to access climate finance to help them maintain their values. And this is what unites them. Although these are areas with low levels of industrial human use, I'm not saying that they're areas without human presence. As has been stated by both previous speakers, many of these areas have populations of indigenous and other local communities who've been using, managing and owning them for long periods of time. And that's part of why they've retained their high value. Sorry. So the challenge that all of these areas face in obtaining climate finance, for me, is encapsulated in this image. That image. I hope you all saw it. This image. So this is an image. This is an image from my home country of England. These are the famous White Cliffs of Dover. And these began life as a biological carbon sink. This is a huge pile of shells of tiny sea creatures which have drawn CO2 out of the air and out of the water to construct their shells, turn them into calcium carbonate. And over time, this biological sink has turned into a geological store, and the cliffs we now see. Now, this CO2 store is no part of the climate negotiations. No one is worried that CO2 is being emitted from these cliffs, from these rocks. And the same perception exists for some of the intact forests we're talking about. They're perceived to be at no risk, to be as inert, as safe, as secure as the White Cliffs of Dover. But it's simply not the case. Evidence shows quite clearly that rates of change are quite high, even in intact areas, if you use the right metrics. And for example, in just the last 16 years, around just under 10% of the world's most intact forests have experienced some kind of loss. Some of them have been, some of them have been deforested, but a much larger area have been degraded in some way. And we need to find ways to express this, to capture this importance for the climate in ways that are not represented fully by the current system. We've done a piece of work to try to unpack the full climate importance of change in these areas. And this chart aims to summarize. I will do that. So this chart aims to summarize the scale of what I'm talking about. So one click, please. So this is the level of carbon impacts from disturbance of intact forests over the last 10 or 15 years. And you can see it's a problem that's in the scale of several gigatons of carbon being emitted over the long term. The central bar shows the relatively small contribution of deforestation, which is what gets seen by most of the carbon accounting. Actually, there's a much larger carbon impact taking place due to degradation of these areas, and that's partly the logging that takes place, organized and small-scale logging that takes place as road networks go in. It's also caused by the insidious effects of degradation around newly created forest edges, where carbon stocks decline, going hundreds of meters into the forest, and also the poorly recognized impacts of I'll let you know when it's time to move on. How should we do it that way? The poorly recognized impacts of loss of wildlife species. As Russ mentioned, important dispersal species are lost from forest, and over time the carbon content of that forest declines because of the loss of certain tree species. The third, and surprisingly the most significant of the three in this analysis, is the importance of the loss of the sink function of these forests. Intact primary forests around the world are not static, as we were, perhaps many of us were taught at school. They've continued to grow and accumulate carbon over many decades, a process which is believed to be caused primarily by the fertilization effects of the increased levels of CO2 in the atmosphere. Next slide, please. Next, please. Yes. So we come back, and if there's one point that you remember from this presentation, I'd like it to be this one: the importance of the intact forest sink for the global carbon cycle. We've come back to the diagram I showed you at the start, but now I'm highlighting a different arrow, not a red one of emissions, but a green one of absorption. And the land sink, which is primarily absorption by tropical and boreal intact forests, primary forests, is soaking up between 1/4 and 1/3 of all humanity's emissions each year. If we allow these intact forests to be degraded and that service is lost, the rate of accumulation of CO2 in the atmosphere will be very much higher. And this is a very significant service that these forests are providing, almost unrecognized. For now, we act as if this was not happening. Avoided damage to this sink is not recognized and rewarded anywhere in the current system. And this is a serious oversight. So I've talked a bit about how we're underestimating the current levels of carbon loss from these intact forests, and how recognizing that better would help to serve the HFLD argument. Next slide, please. There are also a couple of ways in which we underestimate the future levels of loss of carbon from these intact areas, these HFLD areas. One is that in many parts of the world, we can expect an acceleration of emissions over time. This is a widely recognized process as countries go through the various stages of their development. They typically start with very low rates of deforestation, and this accelerates over time, reaches some peak, the highest rates of loss, and then gradually tails off as all the most available forests have been cleared or exploited. And then in some countries, there's a recovery of forest cover further down the line. But any countries that are at the starting point of this curve, the current climate accounting process does not recognize the likelihood of acceleration of loss. This is a widely recognized pattern, but it's actually proved very difficult to capture this process in a way which has been credible and widely accepted by all the participants in the climate process to date. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So my final substantive point is that there's another way in which we underestimate the future emissions from these HFLD areas around the world, and that's the risk of leakage. This is the issue whereby if you are successful in preventing deforestation and degradation in one area, you may find that it simply moves to another area. It may move to another part of your country, it may move to an adjacent country, it may even leap to a different part of the world. And of course, this can happen if the demand for a particular agricultural product remains high and the finance is mobile, or the agents of change are mobile, then they'll simply go somewhere else to try and produce the same product in a different way on other forest land. And detailed economic analysis and some observed case studies have shown this is a really serious issue, and the REDD+ process needs to take full account of it. There have been some efforts to recognize it in the current system. For example, the effort to try to ensure that every country with significant area of forest is participating in the REDD+ process to some extent. That's an attempt to try to minimize the pressures of leakage, but without HFLD type approaches, without positive incentives for some of those countries that leakage might move to, it's unlikely to be fully successful. Next slide, please. So I'm going to sum up now. In terms of the technical aspects of what I've presented. I think the most important points are that it's important to think about HFLD areas not just at the country scale, but also to consider HFLD regions and landscapes in other countries. And in terms of the importance of those areas, the amount of carbon that's being emitted right now from those areas is much greater than we currently appreciate. Secondly, the rates of change in those areas are likely to become, to accelerate in the future. And thirdly, a point I wasn't able to cover in detail, these areas also provide a huge range of other exceptional values in protecting local and regional climates and being resilient to climate change themselves so that they will survive the coming 100 years of rapid change. Last slide. So the next presentation is going to explore some of the solutions that have been attempted to date and some of the opportunities that are associated with those. In thinking about those solutions, I think it's essential that we find ways to maintain the integrity of these intact forests. The mechanisms we're using at the moment are not yet sufficient. We need to broaden our thinking to all HFLD-like areas. We need to recognize both carbon and non-carbon values. And perhaps to sidestep some of the blockages we've experienced in the past, we may need to look beyond a direct focus on results-based payments approaches to explore creatively some of the other ways that the values of these large intact areas can be incentivized to be retained. So at that point, I'll thank you and hand back to Cedric.
Thank you, Tom, for giving us the global perspective, as well as the importance of intact forests for climate change. After we have had male presenters, we'll now have the female presenters. May I invite Dr. Danae and Kimberly Todd to present next. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cedric. Goedemorgen, dames en heren. Ladies and gentlemen, your excellencies, it's a real pleasure to be here. And as my co-panelists, I would like to thank the government of Suriname for this opportunity and inviting us. We will speak to you today about like Tom just said, about the different opportunities, the current treatment and different opportunities for HFLD countries and areas under the current regime. And as you can see from the presentation, we've prepared it jointly with our colleagues from WCS. Hier drukken. Okay, fantastic. Just a very quick overview of our presentation outline. There are 4 main parts to our presentation, and I'm co-presenting with my colleague Kim, who will be joining for the second part. So very quickly, we'll present a quick overview of the current frameworks for action, so the Paris Agreement, and within that, nationally determined contributions. We'll quickly look at the HFLD's situation within the current context of the UNFCCC, Warsaw Framework and RED+. Tom already touched upon some of it. Then we'll start looking very quickly at the current treatments of HFLDs in the existing finance mechanisms. And then we'll look at options to enhance the support to HFLD countries and areas. So it's a lot of information, but we'll try and move through it fairly quickly. Very quickly, already mentioned before, but the Paris Agreement has 2 key points that we think are important hooks for HFLD countries and areas. Firstly, Article 5 really centers on the central reality for them that they would like to use. Now, how this can be done is in a variety of ways. Some of them presented as a multi-sectoral or economy-wide target. Other countries look at specific LULUCF targets and or indication of specific activities like, for example, zero deforestation, agricultural or agroforestry. So there's no set recipe to do this, but there are several opportunities that countries are thinking of and can continue to think about. Zooming down one level further, let's look at HFLDs and RED+ specifically. The UNFCCC does not define an HFLD country or even make a reference to it. And but it does allow adjustments to the forest reference emission level to allow to account for national circumstances. So what are national circumstances? Again, here there's a lot of flexibility within the UNFCCC context, as these circumstances are not further detailed. So countries can tell their story to say what their national circumstances are and how these could be used. Furthermore, the UNFCCC does not provide details on what is considered to be an adjustment while creating the forest reference emission level. The forest reference emission level is the baseline against which results are measured for REDD+. So what are the possible adjustments for HFLDs and the conservation activity? You may remember REDD+ has 5 main activities: reducing emissions from deforestation, forest degradation, sustainable management of forests, enhancement of forest carbon stocks, and the conservation activity, which many countries present here today fought very hard for in the UNFCCC negotiations to be recognized. Of the current forest reference emission levels that have been submitted to the UNFCCC as of 2018, how many countries presented a reference level with an adjustment? So we had a look, and those are 4 countries for the moment: Colombia, Congo, Guyana, and Vietnam. And we also asked the question, okay, how many countries did actually include conservation as a REDD+ activity? And for now, those are Chile, Malaysia, Panama, and Uganda. Now, conservation is defined in varying ways across countries. The UNFCCC doesn't define the REDD+ activity, so there is flexibility for countries to use it to their best advantage with regard to their national circumstances. And different countries include conservation in different ways. Now, looking quickly at what is the current treatment of HFLD countries and areas in existing results-based payment programs. Again, there is no single definition across these programs to categorize an HFLD. And existing results-based payment programs and agreements in the context of REDD+ vary in terms of their treatment of HFLDs. Some of them, including the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility Carbon Fund and the Green Climate Fund, provide incentives for HFLD countries and areas through adjustments. So there are opportunities there. While others, like the REM or other bilateral joint declarations, do not offer flexibility for financial incentives to HFLDs. So it's not all bad. There is some flexibility built in, and there are some opportunities, while others are less open for the moment. The next 2 slides are complicated technical slides, and I won't go into detail, but we chose to leave the information on the slides for those of you that would like to have further information on it later after the conference and take time to think through it. The first one is on the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility Carbon Fund, and with some information on how they look at allowing for adjustments made upwards based on historical deforestations and what their conditions are to allow for those adjustments. So in terms of the carbon fund, it's very straightforward. They look at a 10-year historical average and whether or not the country adjusts upwards, yes or no. And they have to, a country that wishes to do so has to demonstrate to the satisfaction of the carbon fund certain criteria in order to be able to make that adjustment. So it's a negotiation then between the country and the carbon fund. For the Green Climate Fund, as we heard before, there is the results-based payments pilot program under the Green Climate Fund. So to pilot this 3rd phase of REDD+, to grant results-based payments to countries that demonstrate results under the Warsaw Framework. And again, the way the Green Climate Fund looks at it is it provides for some flexibility, asking the question based on historical data, is it equal to or below the average of annual historical emissions during the reference period, unless you're an HFLD country? Now, the Green Climate Fund is a little less prescriptive here compared to the Carbon Fund on what it means by adjustment and what conditions need to be met. But so there are opportunities there for the Green Climate Fund results-based pilot program for HFLD countries. It's an important percentage. Finally, we thought also it would be interesting to give an example of a nearby neighbor here in Guyana, and delegates from Guyana might provide further information on it. But Guyana applies a provisional national reference level that guides the amount of the payment the government of Norway contributes to the Guyana Red Plus Investment Fund. And it's a combined incentive reference level. I don't know if the pointer works. I'm going to try it. No pointer. You have two main lines that I'd like you to look at very quickly. The top dashed line, which are the rates of deforestation in developing countries from 2005 to 2009. And then the bottom red dashed line, just over Tom's head, I don't know if you can see it, which is the annual rate of deforestation in Guyana. Now, the full red light is the baseline against which payments are made. So the baseline of the average between those two dotted lines. And then the results, payments for results, are basically made on the difference between those levels. So the black arrows that you see over there. And if the deforestation goes above a certain level, which is the solid blue line, then those payment levels are reduced. So it's a little complicated, but it's actually a very simple solution that Guyana and Norway came up with to recognize the HFLD situation and allow for payments. I will now give over to Kim to present 5 options for moving forward.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you to the government of Suriname for the invitation, and very happy to be here with all of you for the next few days. So what we wanted to do now that we have that broad context of the experience with Red Plus results-based payments and some of the challenges, which we'll certainly be hearing more detail over the next few days from specific country experiences, we wanted to, with our WCS colleagues who we jointly prepared this with, put on the table some potential options for enhancing financial support for HFLD countries and areas. So these are just to tee these options up, have them on the table to further consider and explore in our discussions over the next couple of days. So we've divided the options into sort of 2 categories. Using the current framework, so maximizing the opportunity we have with the current frameworks, and then also considering how might we modify global frameworks, consider new approaches going forward. So I won't go into each of the 5 options. We have a slide on each, but that's the general way we're categorizing this. So option 1, making the most of the current results-based payment frameworks, or RBPs, Red Plus RBPs. So looking at only what we have on the table now, right, for current Red Plus results-based payments frameworks, we have the multilateral side and the bilateral option. So on the multilateral side, you heard about both the FCPF and the Green Climate Fund. FCPF, while closed to new countries, so we're looking here on the multilateral side at Green Climate Fund potential. And as you heard, there is flexibility there within the Green Climate Fund results-based payments pilot to adjust FRELs in those cases where a country is characterized as an HFLD and is eligible to make that adjustment. So, with the limitations around those adjustments as described, there is potential there. Bilateral, we heard about the combined incentives model. So, other sort of bilateral arrangements being put into place where similar sort of incentives could be in the nature of that agreement are a possibility. However, when we think only strictly in a Red Plus RBP context, in the context of measuring these emission reductions against an adjusted reference level, we're still, the hypothesis or premise that we're operating under is that there's still going to be a fundamental financing gap for HFLDs, because the longer term threats facing these countries argue for a different approach. And we can discuss that premise. But so with that, we thought, well, what are the other options to consider here to address that fundamental financing gap? So option 2. So first, let's stick within an RBP context and recognize that there are some options here where we may look at not only how the finance the performance is assessed at an international level, but how that finance may be distributed or allocated at a domestic level. So the idea here is, while the national level results-based payments may be focused on measuring in terms of emissions reductions against a FREL, are there options in terms of the national allocation to look at other parameters, other metrics beyond the emissions reductions that may recognize, area of forest conserved, biodiversity, other metrics that those payments can be distributed to HFLD areas, perhaps within the country, and so on. So that's just an option to consider, and there are examples of that already in terms of these, in terms of benefit distribution plans under the FCPF Carbon Fund, in terms of how Brazil distributes, and we may hear more about that in terms of the Amazon Fund finance. So the next option, so this is the final option area in terms of maximizing the potential of existing funds, is to think beyond that context, focus specifically on results-based payments, measuring emissions reductions against a FREL. And there's a very large pool of funds sort of available for forest-related projects and programs when we think more broadly, when we think of adaptation and mitigation, when we think about biodiversity, when we look to beyond results-based finance. So this is also, it can also be REDD plus specific finance, but in terms of upfront financing for implementation, right, to ultimately achieve conservation or reducing deforestation. So this is not an exhaustive list here at all, but just some examples, right? We have GEF funding, where we have both biodiversity and climate change focal areas. There are the impact programs there that can be well suited to HFLDs in terms of sustainable forest management and food systems, land use, and restoration impact. Another example is looking at the social dimension, the social benefits. So an example of this would be the International Land and Forest Tenure Facility, the RRI facility here. Deforestation supply chains. So we know, of course, this is a big area. Numerous companies are committing to these deforestation-free supply chains. And there could be opportunity there to partner with private sector to provide those deforestation-free commodities, while conserving forests. So again, not exhaustive. This sort of leaves out the broader availability of funds within the Green Climate Fund on mitigation and adaptation, but that was very well covered in the background paper. So that's another option that would fall within this category. Option 4. So now moving on, thinking ahead, maybe thinking a little outside of the box here in our discussions. Are there ways to adjust existing climate finance mechanisms? So potential for existing mechanisms to be adjusted, to the incentives to be adjusted perhaps moving forward to allow greater incentive for HFLD countries or areas, jurisdictions. GCF beyond the REDD plus RBP pilot, what might that look like? We heard the proposal for, could there be a new window under GCF for HFLDs? So these are, ideas to explore further, perhaps. Countries in the room may have attended the recent Climate Investment Fund's annual meeting, and there's a whole discussion there, right, of the future of climate finance architecture and sort of how to address challenges that may have been an issue in the current funds under the climate investment funds, and could there be more space there to incentivize conservation efforts and for HFLDs. So that's option 4. And then another aspect of option 4 could be looking within the UNFCCC itself. Are there places within the UNFCCC policy agenda that may, going forward, could it be tailored to support HFLDs in a bigger way? Maybe that's something we can discuss more here in the NDC context, in terms of ensuring that forests are well integrated into NDC implementation, into the accounting, into the long-term climate strategies. Another new area that's sort of emerging and offers potential. And then finally, additional incentive structures for the plus activities. Is that an option as well? So these are all questions, of course, because this is looking forward and we're considering what might be opportunities in the future. And let's see, option 5, looking at new funding approaches. So on the one hand, is market-based finance an option for HFLD areas? It could be. That's the Article 6 cooperative approaches are an area still under negotiation, but there's a lot of interest already in piloting these approaches. While it may not seem the most likely option, again, at the national level and achieving emissions reductions that could be transferred, perhaps there's a model like we discussed on the earlier slide, the allocation side, right? So domestically, where you might set up that cooperative approach to offer incentives domestically for HFLD areas to prioritize payments or resources toward HFLD areas. So that's another stream of work to keep an eye on. And then finally, in terms of new funding approaches, are there innovative funding approaches that could be particularly relevant for HFLDs? And here we have one that seemed particularly fitting to present here. So the International Forest Finance Facility is a concept that's in development. It's being facilitated by the World Bank with partners like the Center for Global Development and the Rockefeller Foundation over the course of this year. And this is a new long-term funding source that would, the concept is that it would be a new long-term funding source redirecting a small portion of sovereign wealth and debt already held in investor country portfolios and directing that towards forest conservation and reducing deforestation. So they're working on what that innovative finance mechanism might look like, how you might allocate the excess returns. The shares of excess returns would then be allocated back to countries. They're trying to consider how they can measure performance, what metrics to use, and considering within that what metrics may work better for HFLDs than what we've seen in a red context. So this is certainly something to keep an eye on. The folks developing that will definitely be looking to the discussions here at this conference, I would say, as inputs into their further thinking on that. So something to keep in the back of our minds as we continue on with the conference. And yeah, that's all we have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Danae and Kimberly, for that presentation. Not only identifying the gaps and obstacles that HFLD country face in the current mechanisms that we have, but also giving 5 options that can help with climate finance. We have actually 8 minutes left, but I think Jason, if I may invite you to lead the discussion, we can take maybe an extra 2 or 3 minutes to facilitate discussions. I've been told that not only from the audience we'll take some questions, but questions have been submitted also online. So the online questions will also be part of this discussion. Jason, you have the floor. Thank you.
Okay, thanks everyone. Thank you to the government of Suriname for the opportunity to be here and for being such gracious hosts, and to all of you distinguished delegates and honored guests. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to come and try to sum up what's been discussed so far in this first panel, and then move us forward into a round of discussion, which sounds like it will be a brief round, but important nevertheless. So I'm also a trained scientist, and I'm eager to delve into all the details that we've heard so far in the presentations, but I'm going to resist that temptation and try to keep things at a high level. For about the past 10 years, I've been working at the UNFCCC and thinking about the ways that that science that we've heard about this morning can be integrated into the kinds of policies that were just described in the last presentation. So I want to stay focused on that if we can. We've heard very clearly this morning about the special role of forests in climate change and the particularly special role of HFLD countries as stewards of this forest, and perhaps that there's been a lack of recognition of their efforts to be good stewards of those forests. And I think that's the key issue that we want to try to address at this conference, is how can HFLD countries speak with a more unified voice and elevate the importance of their work as stewards of those forests in the context of the changing policy dynamics and the changing climate dynamics that we're trying to address. So I was reminded of this as I was looking over the recent IPCC report on here talking about. So how do we get there? As a first recommendation, I think the purpose that we've all come together here to begin to put together a common platform to speak with one voice as HFLD countries about the importance of this is going to help achieve that recognition and draw the support that's necessary in order to play that crucial role and meet that level of ambition that's necessary. If we successfully accomplish that here, we will be joined in the international policy spaces by the boreal forest countries who have also recently put out a declaration, the Haparanda Declaration, where they talk about the importance of boreal forests. So we're going to have these two declarations raising the issue of forests and their importance for the climate issue going forward. And I think that's going to help to provide a unified and strong voice about that importance at the international level. So I think we won't be able to ignore the issue anymore. And it won't be on the basis of let's reduce emissions or something like that. It's going to be acknowledging the importance of standing forests and the crucial role they play. So I think there's a key opportunity there. Maybe we'll just provide, sort of a little bit of thinking about the way forward then. In my mind, as Kim just illustrated, I think it's most advantageous for HFLD countries to focus on the opportunity and the successful policies that they've had in the past, the successful approaches in being good stewards of the forests, and not necessarily focus on the threats, even though the threats are many. I think that the international audience is going to be most receptive when they understand that the protection of the forest is part of the sustainable development agenda that you have in mind for your own countries. I think that puts us on the best footing going forward. And part of that is involved in the way we assess progress or even the way we define results. As a recommendation, again, I think it would be important to broaden the scope of what we consider as results beyond what's been in the past under REDD+ considered for results-based payments, but to think more broadly about mechanisms, financial approaches that were just highlighted that can help address the issue of stocks and sinks, in addition to the work we have going now to reduce emissions from forests and in particular deforestation. So I think that's the key challenge that this group faces over the next few days, is to how to articulate and define what that would look like as a policy approach, to think about what is necessary, what's the proper mechanism that's fit for the purpose of protecting stocks and sinks, and that can stand alongside our current efforts to reduce emissions from deforestation. So with that, I think I'll pause and we can turn it into a discussion of questions from the floor addressed to members of the panel and also coming from the web.
Thank you. Jason? Questions from the floor? Can we have a microphone here, please? Please state your name and your question.
Hello, Cedric.
Hello.
My name is Carlos Manuel Rodriguez. I'm the Minister of Environment and Energy from Costa Rica, and I got a couple of quick questions to Dr. Mittenmeyer. I'm willing to know why now more than ever, head of states doesn't believe in science. That's my first question. Not just in the north, more and more everywhere around. And my second question, Ross, is more and more as you show us today, science is telling us that it doesn't make any sense to log primary forests, not just on the tropics, but as well in temperate and boreal areas. Why do we have the UN Forest Agency, which is called FAO, keep on hammering that we need to keep on logging primary forests, something that we've been trying for 50 years and we haven't been successful at all? What is your impression about FAO, and what is your beliefs on what should be the role of FAO?
Thank you, Minister.
Two very heavy questions. I'll start with the second one. I think that there are, I mentioned in the end of my presentation, that there are old entrenched behaviors. When we look at forests, as we did in the 19th century, we see them as being valuable only if we can log them and then convert them to some sort of agricultural commodity. And there's just an enormously increasing body of information that shows that primary forests in particular, forests in general, have so many more values, from biodiversity to their value for indigenous people to the carbon sinks, et cetera, but somehow we manage to ignore the science. And coming to your first question, I wish I could answer why so many heads of state now, or at least certain heads of state, right? Our dear President Trump, Bolsonaro in Brazil, why they are choosing to ignore all of this information and follow this really very negative path. On the other hand, you do have enlightened governments, and there are governments that are turning around. There was just an election in Madagascar where the guy who staged the coup in 2009 has come into power, and I think he has learned over the past 10 years, and I think he's going to be a more positive force for conservation. So it's a constant ebb and flow. You get governments that go down the tubes, and you get others that show greater levels of enlightenment. I mean, the government of Gabon, for example, which is represented here by Lee White, I think they're really an enlightened government in terms of conservation policy. So I think we should really try to highlight the importance and give a lot of credit to those governments that are doing good things, and maybe set them up as models for the countries that are not following the kind of behaviors that we think they should be following. So that's the best I can do in terms of that answer. But my God, I mean, I just don't understand why the public in my country has chosen a path, or at least a certain portion of the public in the United States has chosen a path of ignorance and calling scientific information fake news. I mean, it's just absurd.
Thank you for the answer. Can we go to a question online before we go to the next question? Below are the details of the challenges I have experienced with getting funding in my country as follows. The afforestation industry is not given much emphasis in funding the projects. Banks are not providing much loans for the projects associated with afforestation. There are policies related to afforestation, but they are not too emphasized towards funding the afforestation projects. I would like to see the UN bodies associated with environment management make efforts towards funding afforestation projects. That's a comment, I believe. Not sure if it's a question. Any maybe of the UN bodies wanting to answer or make a comment? If not, then we'll move to the third question. Gentleman there, if you can state your name and even your country, and then a question, please.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm sure if I can speak in French because there are some colleagues. Okay, thank you. I'm Gervais. I'm from Central Africa Forest Commission. It's a pleasure for us to cross the Atlantic and to come here to share some experience in this issue of high forest cover and low deforestation. Ok, ma question est relative à cette question soulevée par nos deux collègues du PNUD. Ils ont abordé l'aspect lié à un nouveau mécanisme qui est en pipeline avec la Banque mondiale et la Fondation Rockefeller, si j'ai bien retenu. Ma préoccupation est la suivante. Nous avons fait RED+, dans nos pays. Il y a des mécanismes qui sont aujourd'hui mis en place. On a vu le front carbone avec le FCPF. Il est clair que tout est associé au carbone. Tout est associé au carbone et le taux, naturellement, du prix à la tonne associé à tous ces efforts ne reflète pas justement les efforts qui sont consentis dans les pays en matière de conservation et de gestion durable. J'espère que les amis de la Banque mondiale et de la Fondation Rockefeller sont là parce qu'il faut explorer de nouvelles opportunités pour pouvoir répondre à cette préoccupation que nous avons au niveau de nos pays. Merci.
Thank you for the question. Danny, I know you speak French, so if you can explain maybe to the audience the question that was posed.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for the question. Apologies for the delay. I think we're very much in agreement, and I think that was the message I think we were aiming to get across, to recognize that that focus has been more strictly, on carbon and more specifically on emissions reductions measured against a reference level. And so looking at the importance of the stocks, that the stocks are increasing, the broader suite of benefits, there's more and more interest and acknowledgement of this. I would say if you saw in the new funding facility, for example, in development is very much, that we mentioned on the last slide, that the bank is leading efforts on, is very much recognizing that broader suite and going beyond those metrics within RED and what we've seen in the current financing facilities. So I think the potential is there, the recognition is there. I think events like this can build that momentum to start thinking about those alternative or complementary means of finance.
You wanted to add something to that, Danny? If not, can we have a last 1, 2, and then we'll finish. Gentleman here, please.
Thank you very much. Cyril Kormos, Executive Director of Wild Heritage based in California. Just a comment. We heard a lot about the very large areas of primary forest, and those are important because primary forests have both the largest carbon stock and the safest carbon stock, so the most stable. An undisturbed primary forest does not burn. So it is both the largest carbon stock investment, the safest, and the lowest risk. So it's a very, very important point. But the other point that I didn't hear so much discussed is the importance of the smaller areas of primary forest, because those are the areas that provide the basis for natural regeneration of primary forest and of natural forest around them. So most natural regeneration happens within a few hundred meters of a primary forest and on area that used to be primary forest. So even these small areas are critically important for conservation and for carbon stocks and for rebuilding the forest. So just an invitation to think about both levels, both scales, both the large areas that are the safe, big investments and the smaller areas that are critical for biodiversity and critical for restoration, and an invitation to the panel to comment. Thank you.
Thank you. Any of the panelists wanted to comment on that? Ross?
Yeah, Cyril, as you know, I've been long an advocate for the importance of the biodiversity hotspots in spite of the fact that areas like Madagascar have lost 90% plus of their natural vegetation. If we're really looking long-term at restoration efforts, and if we really want to restore these forests to their full glory in terms of fauna and flora, we have to have those core areas, however small they may be, available to ensure that we can have restoration, real restoration, not just tree plantations growing out from those core areas. And another point I want to make is that, you know, we talk about the HFLD countries and the risks being longer term. They're not really longer term. They're immediate. I mean, I was in Sumatra and Borneo and the southern part of the Brazilian Amazon 30, 40 years ago, and they were still largely intact. Now look at them. They're not intact anymore, that's for sure. And the pressures that impacted those regions that have become hotspots are now hitting these countries, Suriname, Guyana, wherever you want to look. And so I think that the threats are not long-term to HFLD countries. They are immediate, and those countries could be turned into disaster areas very quickly if current trends continue. So, and it's not 30 or 40-year timelines anymore. It's just 5 or 10 years in many cases. So we have to get beyond this thinking that, oh, the threats are longer term, so we don't have to worry about the HFLD countries.
Any additional comments? Nobody? All right, then we'll move to the last.
Thank you for the opportunity. Joy Ingrid dos Santos Damon. I'm a Surinamer. Firstly, congratulations to my government and actually all the partners that made this possible. I'm humbled by your presentations, your participation on this important conference in Suriname. What I'd like to bounce to you in the group, especially because we have you all here present, people with a huge amount of experience in different HFLDs across the globe, on all the continents. Your wealth of experience, your knowledge is very important for us, considering that, yes, we are very proud of our environment. We would like to keep it that way, but we also believe
Hold on, please. Because the meeting is being recorded, so.
Dank u wel, dank u wel. I also believe that we should not exclude, not ignore the fact that we are living in a dynamic, changing world, and we are a country that is still looking to improve, to continue its socio-economic development. Take, for instance, other aspects of our environment that are, we're a low-lying country, and we are also having to deal with the rise of sea levels. There is a very old idea, it's not mine, I think I'm part of a group of people who are thinking towards going further south, and there is even a group who is thinking of building a new capital in Suriname. Now, I would love for you to, any of you, to elaborate on this, any experience in other countries, so that we don't see this as a threat, rather that we see it as an opportunity for Suriname to perhaps become a benchmark in how you can do this sustainably, while keeping, preserving, loving our environment, because we are part of it. So I'm thinking of biophilia and things like that. So please don't see it as a threat. Let us think together. This is a huge opportunity. So we would love for you to assist us in this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that question, or for that comment. But we'll take the last question here. The lady next to Joy wanted to ask something or make a comment. And then we'll definitely close it up now.
Thank you.
Well, yeah.
I'm Elizabeth from Malaysia. Well, I appreciate all the presentation, and I do support all the presentation and comments made, but I failed to see one part. Besides human intervention, the current threat that's also threatening the intactness of primary forests, I would like to call it natural forests, is basically climate change. I just want to share an experience in my country. We have got large tracts of natural forests and protected forests, virgin forests. In 2014, we had 600 millimeters of rainfall for about 1 hour in some of our forested areas. As a result of that, our forest was affected. And come 2015 and 16, we had the highest temperature. So how can forests adapt to this very quick changing conditions over a period of less than 12 months? And I think that is something that we need to take into consideration. And that's where probably the RED Plus mechanism failed, because we are building on past emissions,
Experiences.
where you don't take into consideration this. Your baselines could at some point go up, your emissions, not because of anthropogenic emissions, but RED Plus has not got a mechanism at this point to differentiate this. So this is something which the high forest, low deforestation countries should really look at and push forward. Having said that, also to Excellency Minister of Costa Rica, he was asking, why is FAO pushing the question, asking countries to log their forests? I do think logging forests in a sustainable manner, meaning you follow the principles of sustainable forest management, it does build resilience. Malaysia has some data sets actually to support this. So I think we have to look at holistic approach in addressing this, and we cannot just look from the human intervention only. Thank you. I also appreciate comments.
Thank you for that intervention. So in your response, panelists, if you can combine those two comments or questions that have been posed. Ross, we will start with you.
Yeah, I'd like to comment on a question from a colleague from Suriname. First of all, I think Suriname might be the luckiest country in the world. You have no earthquakes, no hurricanes, no tornadoes, no flooding, and maybe that's because you have so much intact forest, no forest fires. I mean, you're amazingly fortunate. If you're concerned about the sea level rise issue, I think the best approach is to protect your mangroves. You already have probably the best mangroves in the region. They need some restoration, but I would really focus on making sure that your mangroves are fully restored so that they can provide a buffer to any short-term sea level rise. So, but you really are in an amazingly fortunate position as a country. So I'll leave the second question to my colleagues.
Hello. I just want to comment on the first question. It was also mentioned that sometimes you have immediate threats and long-term solutions. But in the case of Suriname, it's also important. The issue is that you have to find an alternative for certain economic activities. So as a country, we have to prove that with nature, you can create long-term solutions. But the importance is that in the short term, we also need to prove things. And that is maybe also a message for this conference, that we should look at how can we overbridge the short term to have some facts which show that it's really really possible to engage in activities which are not so destructive, as which is happening right now. That's why I was showing the curve of the logging. And just to add to the comment of Rich, I also agree that logging not essentially is wrong. If there are several ways to do it in a sustainable manner, I think we can combine this in a sustainable forest management. So you take advantage of the possibilities of nature and do some sustainable logging at the same time. Yes.
Thank you. Any other comments or reactions from the panel? Jason, please.
Thanks. Just wanted to respond to Elizabeth, because I think the issue of adaptation to climate impacts is a huge issue, and it's one that's going to be very important for putting us on a good footing going ahead, to ensure that those forests can continue to play their vital role. I don't think we have the whole answer yet. I do think there are some promising signs in terms of early warning systems and monitoring technologies that are going to help shed a clearer light and give us more up-to-date information more quickly so we can understand what those impacts are. I'll just mention one briefly, which is a mission called the Global Ecosystem Dynamics Investigation, which is a sensor that's on the International Space Station now. It's collecting data. It uses a technology that's able to assess forest stocks on a rapid basis. It doesn't just detect land use change, but it actually measures the above ground biomass. So that is something that the US has managed to contribute to this effort in recent months, and we hope that that's going to be successful. But that's just one of a variety of different types of technologies that should give us more up-to-date, rapid information about the status of forests, so that then we can take action and understand the causes of those changes, whether or not they were due to anthropogenic interference and disturbance, or climate impacts, or some other thing. So hopefully we will have more tools in the toolbox available very soon.
Thank you very much. With that, we'd like to close this panel and thank all the panelists as well as the discussant, Jason. A round of applause, please, for the panelists. Since we have taken a lot of time out of the coffee break, I would like to give the floor now to the MC.
Yes. Thank you, Cedric. Thank you, panelists. You can exit this. Exit right, no? Thank you. Before I close this session for the coffee break, there are some small announcements I'd like to make really quickly. First of all, due to my enthusiasm, I neglected to introduce myself. So I will be doing that now. My name is Gina Griffith, and I will be your master of ceremony for these coming 3 days for this conference. So now that we have that out of the way, I would also like to rectify an error that I made this morning in our welcoming of our distinguished guest. And I would like to welcome the distinguished minister, His Excellency Paul Aucust of Nicaragua. I would also like to mention that we do have a dedicated Wi-Fi for the conference, and the name is HFLD, and the Wi-Fi code, the password is HFLD in caps at the @ 2019. So that's it. So for anybody who wanted the Wi-Fi. Also, I would like to make a small reminder for our international guests. We have forms for the field trips that you can pick up at the registration to please give us an idea of where you would like to go. There are 3 field trips, but you cannot go out to all of them because they're all a whole day. So you have to choose. I know that choosing is very difficult, but I think you will be able to do that. So with that, I would like to close this first session. Please ask you all to join us for the coffee break in the foyer, and also, I believe, outside for anybody who wants to smell some fresh air. Thank you very much, and we will reconvene in 15 minutes. Thank you. Welcome to Paramaribo, the capital city of Suriname. You are here to join us in the HFLD Climate Finance Conference that we will be hosting these coming days. You may know us as a country that is very rich in biological diversity. We have 93% forest cover. But did you know that beside our biological diversity, we're also culturally diverse? We have people here, descendants here from different nations in the world. We have people from Indonesia, from India, from China. In the interior, we have the indigenous and the Maroon communities who have always lived in nature and one with nature. They have preserved nature for us in a way that now we can enjoy it as a people. This is the example that we want to follow. So please, come and join us over the next few days to have meaningful discussions on how we can preserve the environment for us and future generations. I hope you feel welcome, and I would say tangbu.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your kind invitation to address this conference as President of the United Nations Economic and Social Council. I deeply regret that I'm not able to be with you in person. With over 2/3, 69.2% of its land covered in forests and a 0% deforestation rate, my own country, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, is considered a high forest cover, low deforestation country, along with other Caribbean SIDS such as the Bahamas, Guyana, and Suriname. Your focus on the gap that high forest cover, low deforestation countries constitute and their specific needs in terms of climate finance is very timely as we gear up for the High-Level Political Forum Summit in September this year. Excellencies, despite having successfully protected their forests from destruction for centuries, these countries have, by and large, lost out on climate finance. This places their forests and the tremendous capital they have in terms of preventing carbon from being released into the atmosphere in dire need of financing. Developing high forest cover, low deforestation countries are under domestic pressure to grow and develop economically. But at the same time, they have dedicated at least half of their surface area to forests for the benefit of humanity worldwide. In order to meet the goals and targets of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, HFLD countries are looking to the international community. They need support to continue contributing consistently and significantly to storing carbon and mitigating the global effects of climate change for current and future generations. Excellencies, I encourage you to be bold in your deliberations and reach consensus to give a strong voice to high forest cover, low deforestation countries, as this year is critical for the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. This is your opportunity to mobilize action toward creating a momentum for the SDGs. We will have 2 high-level political forums on sustainable development, one in July under the auspices of ECOSOC, and one in September at summit level under the auspices of the General Assembly, which will look at ways to accelerate progress towards all the SDGs. Other high-level meetings of key relevance to high forest cover, low deforestation countries will also be taking place in September this year. The Secretary General's Climate Summit, the high-level dialogue on financing for development, and the high-level midterm review of Samoa Pathway. Your discussions will also be pertinent to the work of the Council and the ECOSOC system, including the upcoming ECOSOC Financing for Development Forum in April and the 14th session of the UN Forum on Forests, a subsidiary body of ECOSOC, in May. Excellencies, I count on your continued engagement with the work of ECOSOC and the HLPF to mobilize action toward creating momentum for the SDGs in high forest cover, low deforestation countries. I wish you a successful meeting. I thank you.
Welcome to my country of Suriname. I am Stephen Tsang. I'm the Minister of Trade, Industry and Tourism, and I would like to welcome you to this beautiful country of pristine rainforests. We have 93% forest coverage, which is the highest in the world. Suriname is part of the HFLD countries, the high forested, low deforestation countries. And we are so excited to have many people from different countries here today with us. Belize, Bhutan, Colombia, Democratic Republic of Congo, Panama, Guyana, Peru, Zambia, and also a warm welcome to other countries like Bahamas, Fiji, Seychelles, Samoa, Sao Tome and Principe, Costa Rica, Papua New Guinea, and even South Korea. We are home to many endangered species. We are home to many endemic birds. Suriname is home to many different cultures. So much depends on the collective efforts of countries of high forested and low deforestation countries to work together to preserve what we have. Once again, welcome to Suriname, host of the HFLD Climate Conference 2019. And we hope you enjoy the beautiful country. We hope you enjoy the people, the cuisine, and please follow us on Instagram and Facebook.
My passion for nature has driven me to capture and share my adventures with you. The unimaginable beauty of my country, Suriname, is largely unknown and untouched. I've made it my life's mission to share my experiences. I believe nature is the source of our existence. Without it, we cannot exist.
Ikakansi vyo kwa yaliva. Yo pocho me weita witani. Oh no, we'll go again. When you are shining, sula domo kifusi. Oh no no, we'll go again. When you kula subi sula kutia tabu. You go, we'll go again. When you are bambu busi kisi busi. Oh no no, we'll go again. Welcome. No no no, welcome. Mikofucha, mibosi kofukiwi. Welcome. No 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 no. Mikofucha la netoli kwa mesi no no. Welcome. Unamufeke tetakala upanga liwabi. Ya inyalibae. Inyaliba. Unamufeke tetakiume lo alesi kaba. No no no. Esi kaba. Na upoilo kukulesi mo. Bipopotabu and petiwa. Wana debana unanga tengi. Didawita punono. Yefo jenege. Mande kula subi sula kutia tabu. Oh no no. Yefo jenege. Mande abani busi kisi busi. Yefo jenege. Mande washaini sula domo kifuru. Oh no no. Yefo jenege. Mande kula subi sula kutia tabu. Yefo jenege. Mande wakani busi kutia liba. Oh no no. Yefo jenege. Mande kula subi sula kutia tabu. Yefo jenege.
Panel lined up, so we would like to begin. Thank you. All aboard. All right? Thank you. There will be more time to socialize amongst each other during lunch, which we will have after this last panel for the morning session. So if everybody is seated, we have the second panel. The topic of the second panel is climate finance, lessons learned and perspectives for the case of Suriname. We have as a moderator, Mr. Raymond Lanveld. Mr. Raymond Lanveld is Surinamese himself, was posted by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Suriname at the mission of Suriname to the UN in New York. In this capacity, he served many processes, including as negotiated for the Group of 77 in China for the outcome of the third International Conference on Financing for Development, the Addis Ababa Action Agenda. He further served in the bureaus of the High-Level Committee on South-South Cooperation, United Nations Forum on Forests, the General Assembly's Second Committee, and the Standing Committee on Climate Finance of the UNFCCC. Mr. Lanveld is currently employed by the United Nations Secretariat and serves in the UN Conference on Trade and Development in the New York office in the capacity of Economic Affairs Officer. Mr. Lanveld and the panelists can now come up on the stage, and then Mr. Lanveld, as the moderator, will take over. Thank you.
Thank you, Gina, for that introduction. And let me use this opportunity also to welcome all in this panel that will talk about climate finance, the lessons learned, and perspectives for the case of Suriname. So that means there will be a presentation from the viewpoint of Suriname, but also learning from other experiences, the lessons that Suriname can take. Let me move on, since we have a challenge in terms of timing, and I really intend to stick to not become between you and your lunch, which might be the most important program item of the agenda today for some of us. So we have, as a discussant, after the presentation, to comment and maybe also make some recommendations based also on the presentations that you will hear today. And the discussant for this panel is Sharon Spiegel, but she's more known as Sherry. And Sherry is currently the chief of the Policy Analysis and Development Branch in the Financing for Sustainable Development Office of the Department of Economic Affairs and Social Affairs of the UN. She currently leads the work on the 60 agency interagency task force on financing for development, which produces also the task force report on financing for development. Sherry has also worked as a foreign advisor to the Hungarian Central Bank and as a consultant to the World Bank and the IFC. She is author and co-author of several books and articles and has an MA in economics from Princeton University and a BA in economics and applied mathematics from Northwestern. Sherry Spiegel. Then we have, if I follow the same line, Joy Temberger, who is representing His Excellency Gilmore Hoefdraad, Minister of Finance of Suriname. Joy is Chief Economist in the Ministry of Finance, and she studied development economics and has experience working in the IMF and the Central Bank of Suriname before she joined the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Continuing, we have Mr. Brian Renton. Mr. Renton is director at the Fernandez Bottling Company and the chairman of the Suriname Trade and Industry Association, which is cooperating with other private sector organizations in the private sector platform. He holds an engineering degree from the Hague University of Applied Sciences. And then we close the line, the group of presenter with my personal friend, who I'm very honored that he could be here with us, Dr. Paul August Kelly, who is Minister and Private Secretary for the National Policies of the President of the Republic of Nicaragua. But he's also here as a member of the Green Climate Fund Board of Directors since 2016, representing the Latin American and the Caribbean group. And I say he's a personal friend because I had the honor to serve with him together in the board of the Standing Committee of the UNFCCC from 2012 to 2016. And I think we did a good job for the Latin American group, if we have to say it ourselves. And Mr. August holds a PhD in political sciences. Now, let me now turn to the panel because the idea is not for me to stand here and talk much. So the first on our list is Joy Temberger, Chief Economist of the Ministry of Finance. Joy, I invite you to address the audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lanveld. I have to start off by excusing the minister for his absence. He was due to speaking to you today here, but urgent work assignments kept him from coming. So I hope I can do a little bit of justice by addressing his statement to you. Unfortunately, I will not be able to answer his questions, which would have been of very much relevance. I am not in his position. I'm just here to deliver the speech, but so you know that he is following the proceedings of this high-level seminar and very important event for Suriname. And he is a stern champion of the cause of preservation of our nature and really sustaining all the richness that comes from it, not only for Suriname, but also for the world, as we hope. Indeed. So on behalf of the Minister of Finance, of course, pleased to be speaking here in front of the Honorable Ambassador for the Environment of the Republic of Suriname, Mr. Winston Lakin, Honorable Speaker of the National Assembly of Suriname, Mrs. Jennifer Geerling-Simons, esteemed members of the Cabinet of Ministers, esteemed representative of the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, the esteemed officer of the Global Wildlife Conservation, Mr. Whitmeyer, and Mrs. Spiegel as well, chairman of the Platform for the Private Sector, Mr. Brian Renton, member of the Green Climate Fund, Honorable Paul Oquist, and distinguished speakers to the conference, other speakers, distinguished stakeholders and guests. So let me begin, and that's really, let the minister begin by quoting the harvest biologist E.O. Wilson. He said, "Destroying a rainforest for economic gain is like burning a Renaissance painting to cook a meal. You know, you have laid up the fire too high. Not that we have many Renaissance paintings to burn in Suriname, but we live in the most forested country in the world, and we respect and cherish our rainforest. Respect and wholehearted support are necessary and welcome. But the minister, he's an economist, and economists look for incentives structures, and as a policymaker, we look to promulgate positive incentives. In other words, let us find ways in which we can strengthen the economic incentives to finance the conservation of our rainforest. The opposite of conservation has been a sad truth around the world in the past decades. The destructive exploitation of the forests for short-term profit considerations has been a mainstay for most countries that still have or once had a dense forest cover. The rainforest and nature in general are not considered the beneficial ally, but as the threat that needed to be rooted out in the name of progress. Some countries might have been highly forested, but forcefully and irreversibly have also lived through high deforestation. Thankfully, Suriname has a history of being a nation with a high forest cover and a low incentive for deforestation. Suriname has even a unique history advancing the cause of biodiversity and science. It was in 1799 when Maria Sibylla Merian came to Suriname to study and illustrate insects. She started the science of entomology as she learned the intricacies of the symbiotic life of plants and insects and their life cycles in our rainforest. Without our rainforest and her work, we might not have seen the universal classification system for all organisms by Carl Linnaeus and Darwin's Origin of Species. Now looking ahead, and we need more than our respect for our rainforest and our history of conservation to maintain the momentum. We need incentives that motivate the participants in our global economy to support the long-term conservation of our unequaled forest cover. There are examples in other countries of how we can proceed to create such incentives and attract foreign conservation investment. In any case, the government and the domestic or foreign financing entities or intermediaries need to agree on a long-term agreement that specifies the financing and the conservation efforts. Possible vehicles that have been successful in other countries include debt for nature swaps, in which investors buy and extinguish government debt in exchange for the government investing the savings for conservation purposes. In the case of Suriname, investors could buy the Surinamese sovereign bond or domestic treasury bills and exchange them for the government's commitment to allocate a part of the foregone debt service to protect the rainforest. Another vehicle that has been used successfully in other countries, like Patagonia in Chile, is the outright purchase of vast tracts of untouched nature, that is, rainforest in our case, with a specific commitment to leave them untouched. In the area of fast and transparent electronic stock listed finance, we can come up with yet an example of tradable nature bonds based on the intrinsic value of nature conservations. A final example of conservation beneficial investment is for investors to finance and operate commercial tourism or production entities that create jobs for the local population and attract visitors and conservation efforts. This creates additional incentives for Suriname to conserve our cherished forest. Examples could be jungle tourism or exports of renewable resources like water. The Minister is sure that other speakers and participants will be able to identify and hopefully initiate specific efforts to help preserve our forest and our outsized contribution to combating climate change. As Finance Minister, he's looking forward to being an active stakeholder in the nature preservation programs and acting as the guardian of sound and healthy financial incentives towards these efforts. On behalf of the Minister, I thank you for all your presence and efforts and would be looking forward to your deliberations. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Den Berge. I picked up 3 points that may be interesting for the discussion and maybe to hear the views of the discussant later when she will make her intervention. The first point is about economic incentives for sustainable forest management. The second point is around the possibilities, and I've heard sovereign bond, maybe green bonds, and water export. The other point, which is interesting, and maybe somebody who has more knowledge of that can bring that that information forward. If I'm right, if I heard correctly, then it is that Suriname has contributed, or the study of entomology, or what the name is, about classification of insects, started in Suriname with Maria Sibela. That's already a great contribution to science and to the contribution of forests to the world, if that's the case. Now let's turn to Mr. Brian Renton from the platform of private sector. Please address the audience.
Thank you. Okay, good morning, distinguished guests. I have a very short presentation. I've been asked to give a perspective from the private sector on climate financing, and as you may expect, I have a little bit more pragmatic approach, giving my background. But I want to start with congratulating the government of Suriname with this initiative, which I consider very timely and important. And I also wish to express my sincere appreciation for invitation extended to the private sector to contribute to this high-level meeting. It's said before, Suriname belongs to an exclusive group of HFLD countries, which provides us with maybe the unique opportunity to access and mobilize international funds to maintain our forest, but also to support sustainable development in our country. To capitalize on this opportunity, we will need the support and collaboration of all parts of our society, especially since it has been recognized that stakeholders' engagement is critical for the realization of sustainable development. It's therefore my sincere wish that we will now really start the process of employing the unique features of Suriname in a sustainable manner. And this conference is a good start. That's why I pointed out that the conference is very timely and important. So I've been asked to give a private sector perspective. But before I do this, I believe that it is important for this audience to understand how the private sector in Suriname is structured, so we have a better frame of reference when we address the question of challenging and opportunities for the private sector with respect to climate financing. You know, the private sector in Suriname is a very diverse community, and especially when considering the size of the enterprises. You can argue that it's true for most of the private sector all over the world, but it is specifically important for Suriname and for the Suriname context. And I will explain why. Most businesses in Suriname can be safely be termed micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises, of which the majority is family-owned. although the micro and the SME sector is critical from an employment perspective, its impact from a macroeconomic perspective is limited. Furthermore, various companies in this sector were or are still geared towards providing goods and services to the public sector because of the large economic role the governments play in our economic society. Also, an important part is dependent on providing services to the mining sector and the oil and gas. When the economy does well, these small companies also fare well because of increased government spending. But during economic downturns, when spending of the government must be curtailed because of fiscal and budget constraints, the SMEs in Suriname immediately suffer, and sometimes closure is unavoidable. We have witnessed this in very recent times. The second layer of the private sector, smaller group, mostly some state-owned companies, food and beverage companies. They have a broader and greater economic and social impact. But in terms of people employed, obviously much smaller than the SMEs. And then we have the third and final layer. It consists of the large multinationals and our state-owned company. And they have a bigger, actually a very huge economic and social impact. And their contribution to the GDP is very much the driver of our economy. When commodity prices do well, the government receives more revenue, the government is able to increase their spending, which leads to greater economic activity, and the SMEs benefit of that. What we've been seeing for the last 3 to 5 years, commodity prices went down sharply. With that, our economy hit very hard. And of course, our private sector got hit very hard. And at this time, major part of the private sector is still battling for survival. So why is this important? Because there is where we see the conflicting situation and the conflicting objectives when we're considering the opportunity of climate financing. On the one hand, we still need the extraction industry and forestry to do well and maybe even expand to support our economy. On the other hand, we have the expectation of the international community about sustainable forest management. Our economy is still too much dependent on the extractive industry. Even though, and let me be strong, let me say that very strongly, even though we have all long recognized that sustainable development for Suriname will only be achieved with a more diversified economy. But reforming and diversifying our economy is challenging and takes time. And time is not on our side. So this is not an easy discussion. Certainly not from the private sector perspective. The question we should ask is now, how can we mobilize and deploy climate financing funds, not only to protect and to preserve our forest, but more importantly, to strengthen the private sector in the non-extractive industries. Obvious industries that we should earmark, and previous speaker already named a few, are sustainable agriculture, ecotourism, services, and sustainable forestry. And I'll come to that in a couple of moments. But even equally important is also to invest in capacity building of the private sector in order to improve our export capabilities. So this topic has been touched in the previous panel, and I want to make a case for sustainable forestry. And it's already said is that we have a system in place in Suriname called the Salos Management System, which was created for the harvesting of tree in such a manner to ensure minimal impact. And again, I made the point that up till now, forestry is an important contributor to our economy. It's our belief that the relevant authorities in Suriname should be strengthened to ensure that the Salos management system is adherent to by everybody. Furthermore, the government must refrain from granting licenses to companies who only want to export logs and have no interest in adding any value in Suriname, since experience has taught us that these companies have no interest in sustainable development. And I think this can be done sooner than later. So our role, the private sector, specifically the private sector in Suriname. The private sector has a role to play in protecting and preserving the environment. But given the size of our country and the size of the private sector and the size of our economy, it's obvious that any effort from the private sector to reduce carbon emission won't move the needle from a global perspective. Nevertheless, it is important that Suriname undertakes effort to mitigate the effects of global warming, and equally important, to start protecting the environment of Suriname. We have many challenges, I would call them threats. In particular, the continuing and expanding use of mercury in the illegal, informal, small and medium-sized gold mining, the dumping of untreated industrial waste in the environment, and the time bomb of our unsanitary municipal waste dump, to name just a few. Our freshwater sources are getting contaminated, heavy metals find their way into our environment, fish is being affected, resulting in a significant threat to humans, especially our indigenous and tribal people who depend on nature to provide them with their basic necessities, such as water and food. The private sector should play an active role in tackling all these challenges and in some instances take the lead. However, going back to the structure of our private sector, the pyramid structure, only a few companies have the necessary resources to independently from the government implement corporate social responsibility policies. The majority of our private sector lack the resources, lack the skills, and do not have access to financing to implement a robust CSR policy. Therefore, the government needs to support and facilitate the implementation of laws, capacity building for small and medium-sized enterprises, as well as introduce and enforce environmental legislation. In our opinion, climate financing could be a source to support the necessary steps that need to be taken, which I mentioned before. So in closing, I would like to end by summarizing our vision, the vision of the private sector. Climate financing maybe can be a huge opportunity for Suriname and the private sector. However, we need to develop a strategy, mechanism, platforms that allow the funds to be deployed in such a manner that the private sector in Suriname is strengthened and developed in order to diversify our economy. The private sector stands ready to work closely with the government of Suriname and other stakeholders to develop these strategies and policies in the interest of our beloved and wonderful nation. I thank you.
I thank Mr. Ranton for his presentation. And as moderator, I've picked out 2 points, which I want to hold in front of you so it can be maybe considered when you're discussing on the case for Suriname. Basically, one major point is within sustainable development, which has aspects of economic development, social development, and environmental development. I think Mr. Ranton was raising some issues that has to do with basically conflicts between economic consideration and environmental consideration, and some of the business practices in regarding to waste management and the use of some chemicals that may be hazardous to the environment, which, why I think private sector should have a place at the table, because they can also have a contribution in providing a solution. And the other one is taking advantage of working at UNCTAD. I understood from Mr. Renton's presentation that the majority of businesses in Suriname are micro and small and medium enterprises. Maybe from here I could advise that it might be a good idea for the Surinamese business community to participate at the global level where SMEs are meeting. First of all, there is going to be the June 27 is the International Day of MSMEs, and there's going to be a meeting in New York with UNCTAD, UNIDO, DESA organizing. Maybe you could try through the International Center for Small Business to become part of that conversation. And at the Financing for Development, the ECOSOC Forum on Financing for Development, the one of the days is in the margin, there's going to be the SDG Investment Fair, where big investors are being invited to see how they can contribute in investing into the areas of the SDGs. I think I could take these 5 minutes for that kind of maybe more economics and UNCTAD related issues, which are also important since we're talking now about the case for Suriname. And in that regard, we've heard 2 presentations, which were typically Surinamese, looking from the viewpoint of Suriname, which direction Suriname could take in the case of HFLDs and so on. We have also invited perspectives from outside, an external point of view for where experience is there in the world that Suriname can learn from. And we have invited a board member from the Green Climate Fund. The Green Climate Fund has been supporting projects that are also related to sustainable forest management and the contribution that forests can make in mitigating climate change. Can I now invite Honorable Paul Ockes to address the audience on forestry, climate change, and forestry climate finance? Paul.
Thank you very much, Raymond, for the kind introduction. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. When we look at climate finance, it's very important, I think, not to get into a box. And HFLD is a very positive concept, very useful concept, and one that's worth fighting for in terms of recognition in the international financial mechanisms. However, I would not get typecast. I would look to keep the financial opportunities open. And that is, I think, the case for all countries, because high forestation countries, high forest cover countries have some deforestation, have some degraded land, and countries that have a lot of degraded land, a lot of deforestation, like my country, Nicaragua, have reserves, like Bosa West, the largest reserve in Central America, or like the Indio Maiz Reserve in southeastern Nicaragua that receives 5 meters of rainfall a year. It's a very dense tropical rainforest. So All of these things need to be taken into consideration, especially as we look to deal with climate change and what the IPCC report tells us of the drastic changes that need to be made